We're delighted to have you today and yesterday. Hopefully everything's gone well for the sessions and you've learned a lot in terms of how to present business plans, develop business plans, and set your company up. When I think about one of the most important things that a founder or a CEO can do, I believe it is selecting and developing a world-class team. And when I think about the job or the business that we're in today, we have an old saying: we'd rather invest in an A team with a B idea than a B team with an A idea. Of course, our ultimate goal is to find those A teams with A ideas, correct? And so if I'm a CEO or a founder of an organization, I'm going to take the same approach to building a team of people, because if you think about the word team, and again, I'm sure you've all heard this, there's no I in the word team, correct? So most of the things that I've been involved in that have been successful because we had a team of people that were all focused on a common vision, working hard with lots of passion to make it happen. So I'm going to talk today about how we can build those world-class teams. These are the topics that we're going to talk about this morning: defining a desired culture, who's on the team. We're going to talk about the definition of an A player, talk a little bit about the jobs of an entrepreneur or a CEO, and I'll share with you some of the lessons that I learned in the process of spending 25 years as an entrepreneur and starting various companies. We set up a hiring system that allowed us to develop the best possible team. I'm going to share that process with you in terms of what we did. There are some tools that you can use to assess people. I'll give you just a brief overview of one of those tools, but I would encourage you to think broadly about other tools that you can use. And then I have a couple of concluding thoughts for you. So how many of you have worked in an organization where you have actually articulated the culture of the organization? In other words, you've written it down and you use that definition to run your organization. So if you don't have an articulated or defined culture, about anyone will do, right? And so when we think about the problems, and we're going to give you some examples of what happens when you mishire. And when you think about the consequences of a mishire on your organization, we're talking about decisions that could be a few $1,000s kind of decision, or we could be talking about a bet your company type of decision, correct? And we'll give you some examples of how that will actually work. So if we take a look, I encourage you to Google culture and defining culture in the workplace. And here we're talking about organizational culture. And if you look at some of the words that we've used on this slide, culture includes the organization's vision, values, norms, systems, symbols, language, assumptions, beliefs, and habits. So culture is important to the practice of the business. It impacts strategically how we're going to move the organization. It influences essentially every decision that we make within that organization. Through that cultural statement, really motivates people. And it gives us a blueprint for essentially those people that we want to hire to help us move our company forward and achieve the vision that we've set for the company. So management decision-making and negotiations are all influenced through culture, and it actually influences every decision that we make. So if you're on the front end of setting your company up, I encourage you to take some time and write down the things that you're going to do to establish your culture. Just a little for instance, when we first started our last company, we had a 5 o'clock beer 15 minutes or 20 minutes. So we'd all get together at 5 o'clock, have a beer or whatever the beverage of choice was, Coke, water, whatever, and it gave us an opportunity to kind of huddle and talk about what had happened during the workday. And that was a great time for sharing. It was a great time for building camaraderie and a great time for further building the culture within the organization. We did that beer thing until the lawyers found out we were doing it, and our insurance agent found out we were doing it, and then we had to think about some other technique to get people together. But the point is getting people together and building that culture, which helps you build your team and have a more successful team. So I'm going to give you 3 or 4 examples of the words that we talked about a moment ago, the words that we use to define culture. For example, vision was one of them. In our company, we had a 5-step process that we were trying to use to grow the company. What these words say is really irrelevant, but the point is that we could visually articulate to our employees, to our associates, that what we were trying to accomplish on a strategic basis. And this is something that they could use to set their own goals and objectives and ensure that they fit within those goals and objectives in terms of their department activities. Another example is language. So in our company, we started to talk in the language using critical success factors. And these are the things that we felt we had to do as an organization to make our company successful. We also spent a fair amount of time putting together detailed and complex business plans. And many times those ended up in big three-ring binders, and guess what happened to them? They went on a shelf someplace, right? Today they would be on your hard drive. And occasionally we would look at them to see how we're doing. But we got the greatest impact from that plan by consolidating that into a one-page business plan and then circulating that to everyone who worked in the company and to many of the outside stakeholders so they could readily see what we were trying to accomplish as an organization. And it got us all focused on those specific tactical goals that we were trying to achieve in that specific operating period, generally a fiscal year. Another word that was used was structure. So here we got a hierarchical management team structure that we're using to develop the company. Are you going to use a flat management team, a matrix management team? How are you going to structure your organization going forward? And the answer most likely is it depends, right? Depends on the development stage that your company is in. If you're a two-person company, obviously it's pretty easy. Everybody does everything, right? If you've grown to a company of 50 people or 100 people, then you got to think about that reporting structure and that structure that you're going to use to make decisions for the organization. So your organizational structure will intentionally become more complicated as you continue to grow the business. So here's a key question: who's on the team? And again, the answer is it depends. If you're an organization at T-minus 90, in other words, you're just putting together the initial business plan for the company, it might be you and one or two or three other people that you're assembling to put the plan together. And it could also be some of those external team members that will be vital to your business as you go forward to help you develop the plan. For example, we all need attorneys to help us put those important documents together, the initial incorporation. There might be buy-sell agreements if you've got a partner in your business. There could be incentive stock option programs that you set up, and the list goes on. So we obviously need an attorney on the team to help us handle those legal issues. Accounting-wise, you may or may not need an accountant to help you. Depends on the sophistication of your financial statements. You may want somebody to come on board and help you look at the numbers, to vet the numbers, to make sure they make sense and that you understand them. Because as you approach investors to invest in your business, one of the key things will be your working knowledge of the numbers. Can you articulate where you're going to go, what kind of growth numbers you're focused on, and how you're going to get there? The board of advisor members, that's also vitally important. And when we started way back when, and I won't tell you the starting date, you can probably look at the top of my head and determine that it's been quite a long time. But at that time, there wasn't the large number of mentors in our community that are here to help people like yourself. But today, if you'll go out and network in the community, there's an enormous number of people that want to give back. And they're willing to take you on and help mentor you through this process. It basically gets back to asking, networking, meeting people, and then asking people to help you. And most of the time, you'll probably be pleasantly surprised that they'll step up to the table and give you some assistance. At some point, there'll be some strategic partners that you'll want to bring into the business, perhaps. And at some point, there's those investors. It could be early stage investors like friends and family, or you might have a later stage business where you're approaching groups like angel investors or venture capitalists to invest additional and more dollars into your company. So let's think about an example here. You've been running your business for a year or two. You've been out in the marketplace. You've got a minimally viable product that you've developed. You've taken that to the market. You've got a few customers. Those customers are actually buying something from you. In other words, the dogs are eating the dog food, right? So we've got a viable product, and we know that because customers are willing to pay. We have now built that sales revenue number to $500,000, which is a pretty substantial amount of money in that time period. and you're taking a look at the team that you have on board, and you've decided that it's time to go out to the marketplace and hire a vice president of sales because you want to spend more time strategically thinking about how to take your business forward. So we go through a vetting process, and we're going to talk about that process in later slides, but we have a finalist. That finalist has 20 years of increasing experience in sales management, has worked primarily for large corporations, and has domain expertise and is willing to adjust their comp package to fit your company's budget. And the CEO likes the company. Time to move forward, right? Let's look at this candidate. Candidate's experience is largely in Fortune 500 companies, no startup experience. You want that candidate or not if you're a small company? Maybe not, but maybe yes, right? Again, it depends. But that would be a red flag for me. Person has spent 20 years advancing in their career, so they've gotten to a point that they want to do more managing than doing. Good sign, bad sign? Probably a bad sign, because no matter what your title is in a small company, you're a jack of all trades. If it means coming in on Saturday and cleaning the bathrooms, that's what you do. So we have to make sure the business moves forward. And in this case, the CEO spent approximately 4 hours interviewing the candidate. Would you feel comfortable hiring the VP level person in your company if you spent 4 hours with them? Maybe, right? In my case, probably not. I'd probably want to spend more time to really get to know that person because you're going to be living with that person lots of hours every day for a number of years. And the candidate, in this case, since we were interviewing for a VP of sales, what do salespeople do? They sell you. So they sold the CEO and hiring the person. The CEO moved forward, and was that the right decision? Well, we're going to come back. That's going to be one of the last slides that we talk about. We're going to look at the consequences of making that decision. Now, you can argue about we can argue about the important jobs of a CEO, but from my perspective, having sat in that seat in 4 companies, and having worked with a number of CEOs over the last couple of decades, I believe these are the 3 most important jobs that an entrepreneur founder or a CEO is responsible for. It's setting the strategic direction of the organization, mapping that out, becoming the top salesperson in the organization, and developing a world-class team, and selecting those people and developing them. Now, that second bullet, I encourage you to pay particular attention to that because a lot of folks don't like this concept of putting a sales hat on, right? They think of a salesperson as a used car sales type. In reality, every human in the world is selling something, correct? Everybody's selling something. And in most cases, you're selling yourself and you're the CEO of you. So I encourage people to think like that and think about what skills do I need to do an appropriate job of selling who I am? And most people don't have those sales skills, but today there's no excuse for not acquiring them. There's lots of things that we can do, including going to YouTube, Google, couple-day classes on selling, et cetera, or perhaps getting a job in a company and actually learning the process of selling over a couple-year period. That's an invaluable skill set as you take your company forward. So one of the people that we paid a lot of attention to when we were running our company, and by the way, we did spend a fair amount of time putting together a culture class that we took new employees through. It was a 4 or 5 hour class which we basically indoctrinated people on how we did business and how we ran the organization and what the expectations were for people who joined our company. And if you think about the positives of that, it gets us off on the right foot with those people, and it lists the expectations of how they're going to operate within the business. So we believe it gives them a greater chance of being successful within our organization. Jack Welch said, if we don't get the people thing right, we lose it. It's the most important thing in all of our businesses. And if you don't know the name, again, you can Google it. He was a famous CEO for General Electric for many years and built that into a world-class organization. So another thing that we looked at, and I talked about this a few moments ago, this concept of an A player. There's a book called Top Grading, and I've got a list of books at the end of the presentation that I'll share with you. But if you look at that book, in page 3 or page 4 of the book, he's got a list of 12 attributes that he uses to assess people, and he puts them in buckets of an A person that has this skill set, a B-level person, and a C-level person. So if we're going to hire an A-level person, these are just 6 of the attributes, looking at vision, intelligence, leadership, drive, track record. Then you can see how he's quantified what he's looking for in order to rate that person as an A, B, or a C player. I'd encourage you to look at the book and look at these attributes and develop a system like this when you're hiring people, because it's an easier way to assess the talent of a person and to make that decision, that all-important decision, are they going to fit within my organization or not? For a high-growth company leadership, an A player in many cases is not good enough. An A-plus player is needed. And I think that's especially true in what we call high-growth enterprises. Those are enterprises where we're trying to create some strategic value that at some point we're going to sell that company either through a public offering or through a large entity that will come in and do an M&A transaction and buy the business. So what are some of the startup lessons that were learned in this startup stage? I touched on this a moment ago. It's called networking. And there's something going on literally every week in this community that you can go out and meet people and network and share your idea and ask tons of questions and get feedback from these folks. We talked about this concept of hiring the best people and looking for A players. That third bullet point is keeping all your stakeholders informed. And I think that's especially critical for people that are working for your organization. We had a monthly meeting where we shared all of our financial information at a high level, progress that we had made on the goals of the company. If you think about that, that really informs people. It helps them make decisions about how they're going to progress in the company and how they're going to continue to evolve to be that A player for you. And it makes them feel connected to your organization because you're sharing the information with them. Stakeholder means beyond just your employees. It means anyone that's connected to the company, and we talked about those earlier on. It could be mentors, it could be your board of advisor members, board of director members, bankers, attorneys, etc. But have a way, a formal way of actually sharing with these people the progress that you're making in the business. And then finally, when we were hiring people initially, and we found that many times it was hire the first person that we thought was qualified and move on. That was a big mistake because in some cases we got to a point where the job outgrew the person. So if you think about that, we hire a person to do a job today, they're okay, skill set's okay. In a year, that job has evolved to the point that they no longer have the skills or experience to do it. What does that mean for you as the entrepreneur or the CEO? That means a really tough conversation, right? Either you're going to have to find a way to coach that person up to be the player that you want them to be, or they're going to have to take another job in the company, or you're going to have to coach them out of the company, correct? Those are very difficult decisions and very tough issues to deal with. So I mentioned a moment ago when we ran this company that we had our own hiring system, and let me tell you a quick story how this came about. I was a part of a CEO group, and when we started this last company, I was 35, and at that time I felt like as the CEO I needed to know everything in the company. That's a big mistake, right? Nobody who works for you expects you to know everything as the CEO. What they do expect you to do, however, is to ask the right questions. And then if you've got these 18 players, guess what? They'll huddle and they'll find the solutions to the questions that you're asking, and they'll feel more connected to the company by virtue of you empowering them to help solve real-world business problems. So as part of this group, I went to one of the earlier meetings, and we brought this consultant in from Chicago, and he had a hiring system that he was promoting, and he took us through an example, which was his accounting system. So picture this. We've got 16 CEOs in the room. First question is, how many of you have a hiring system? How many hands went up? In reality, everyone had a hiring system, correct? They just couldn't articulate it. They couldn't describe what it was. And it could be some makeshift process, but they had a way of hiring people. So he walked us through this. Third question he asked was, how much time do you spend hiring someone? And the range of answers that he got back, and these are CEOs speaking, was from 20 minutes to 2 days. Can you imagine? Maybe hiring a clerical level person, 20 minutes, maybe not. We never hired anybody in our company in 20 minutes. We could barely get the door open in 20 minutes, right? And then we talked about the cost of hiring the wrong person, and we've got an example that we're going to come back to that in just a moment. He went through this process of identifying candidates, and I've got a slide that will give you some high-level ideas. Of course, there's numerous ways today of doing that, including this networking process that we talked about. The second step was creating a job profile, or in other words, a picture of success. And we wanted to set that up on a 3-month basis and a 1-year basis. Now think about the power of that. That gives somebody a roadmap. They're coming into your business, and you've given them a roadmap of how they're going to be successful in your company, correct? And when you have that annual review, guess what? Number one, it shouldn't be an annual review. You should be talking to that person on a more regular basis, correct? But it's also a way for you to pull that roadmap out and quickly assess how the person is doing relative to the goals that you set initially. And it gives you an opportunity to decide whether or not those were the right set of goals and objectives. And you can make a midstream adjustment if they aren't. There are lots of value in using that approach. We went out and recruited applicants. And one of the things that we did early on in this process is we had a conversation about expected compensation. Now, if you think about that for a moment, you're interviewing somebody that's making $100,000 a year, and you've got $50,000 to pay for your position. You've got a mismatch, right? Now, unless you can come up with some creative ways of compensating that person, it may not be the right match. So we had a conversation fairly early in the process of what their expectation was for compensation. And it prevented us from spending a 1 or 2 or 3 day process with an individual only to find out at the end we couldn't meet the compensation that they expected to make. We came up with a short list after sifting through many resumes. We had a telephone interview with these folks. Through this process that the person from Chicago gave us, we had a well-orchestrated list of questions that we could cross-check people on. So we had different people on the team that would ask questions and ask them in a way that we could double-check a person's answer. So you can be really smart in terms of the questions that you ask an individual. And we got the final list down to 1 or 2 finalists. We did our reference checks on these people, which I encourage everyone to do. And by the way, when you're doing a reference check, it's pretty easy to do a cross-reference. So one of the final questions that you ask a reference is there someone else that I can chat with about this person's background? And then one of the final steps in our process was we hired an industrial psychologist to assess the person. And that typically took a 4 or 5 hour process. There were a battery of tests that they went through so we could help assess that person's skill set, their intellect, and most importantly, the industrial psychologist knew enough about our internal culture and the way we operate our business that he could ask questions to probe deeper into whether or not he thought that person was a good match for our company. And if we got a check mark there, then we extended the offer and we were off to the races with that person. One final point that I'll make, closing an employee for your company is kind of like closing an order. Close when you can. Always be closing. And use that closing momentum to bring somebody on. And in a couple of cases, one final point, in a couple of cases, we actually hired a person with more skills than we needed currently because remember what I said a moment ago? As that job continued to evolve, person can bring those skills to the job and be correctly positioned to be a success. In our case, we typically took at least a day, and if we were hiring a senior level person, it could be several days of interviewing the person. The results, what did we get from this? Low turnover. At the end, our organization had almost 400 people in it, and we had low single digits in terms of employee turnover. We had a better match of our job to the person's strengths and passion, and I can't overly emphasize the word passion, because if they bring passion to the job, what you're going to find is they won't call it a job, they'll think about it as their career. And those are the kinds of people that can help you be more successful. We ended up with a much stronger people because we had the right people on the bus in the right seats. And even those applicants that we said no to, came back later on and gave us high marks for the process. And they felt like they had been given an equal opportunity. And they'd learned a lot about themselves, which could help from a career development standpoint. So lots of positives for using this kind of a hiring system. We developed a name for it, called it TEC. T was for traits, which included the person's educational background. E was for experience. Both of those are pretty easy to measure and to interview for, correct? And C was for culture. So now you've listened to me talk about the people that we typically hired in our company. Which of these do you think was the most important? The culture bit, absolutely. And when we looked at the people that we were hiring, if they were entry-level people or lower-level people, from an experience standpoint, we felt we could coach them up and make them successful in the job. If it was a senior-level people, we really expected them to have all three of these: the right traits, the right experience, the right educational background, and the right cultural fit. These are some things that you can look at. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about these. You can see it in the book, but there's lots of ways to get salary information, and I would encourage you to try to pay fair market value for people that you hire. Don't try to underpay, because that creates friction within your employees. So there's lots of ways to go look at what comparable salaries are. I would highly encourage you to do background checks. And then this idea of using stock options, you've probably heard this in other presentations. There's two forms of these. One form is for your internal people. That's called an incentive stock option program. And in the interest of time, we're not going to dive into that. And then the non-qualified stock options are for people that are on your board of advisors, board of directors, or others that you may want to compensate by the use of issuing stock options to those people. And then, of course, there's lots of ways to source people today. I did mention early on that there are some tools. Again, in the interest of time, we're not going to dig into this, but these are quick assessments. And you can find organizations that, like the Culture Index. And if you look at this, what this is saying is it's a profile of how this person is actually doing. And then this red arrow is where we want a CEO level person to be with this type of a profile. We can do it for any type of person, whether it's a technical person, a salesperson, marketing, manufacturing, or whatever. There are certain profiles that we're trying to hire for in those jobs, and using this kind of a test can help us determine if the person has the right profile. So when we invest in deals, as I said a moment ago, we're looking for those A deals with A teams, and quite often we're looking at the strength of the founder or the CEO. And that's a number one determination, and how coachable that person is in order for us to make an investment decision in that company. Having said that, if you do have a high growth enterprise and you think about that, that company more than likely is going to require a number of rounds of capital. And every time you bring more and more capital in, at some point you've run out of angel capital money that you can bring in, and you need to start talking to venture capitalists. What happens to the company when you need VC money? Well, here's some data. Uncommon for a founder to be the CEO at the exit. So that's a concept that if you're thinking about developing a high growth enterprise where you're going to have these multiple rounds of capital, think about the concept that you won't be there to run the ship, to run the company after so many rounds of investment. And think about the job that you can play in that organization if you're no longer the CEO. Because more than likely, you're still going to have a significant stock position in the company, right? So you're rooting for that company to be successful because it's going to impact you financially. So after 3 years, 50% of founders still remain CEOs after the VCs come in. After 4 years, 40%. And at IPO, less than 25% of founders continue to be the CEO of a company. Big turnover. So you need to think about that and how you're trying to drive your company, and whether or not you're going to position it to do an early exit, where you sell maybe in the first 3 or 4 or 5 years and you're still the CEO, or if you're going to take multiple rounds of capital and then you face this prospect that you may no longer be the CEO. On average, VCs replace half to 2/3 of founder CEOs before exiting, and some replace up to 95%. The point that I would make here is know who is investing in your company. So interview them as much as they are interviewing you. Interview these people that you understand that you've got that cultural fit with your investor team. This is just some indication of how your team grows at different critical points. I think a critical point for a company is probably around the $1 million in revenue range. Another critical point is when you get to about 10 million and the team members that you need at that point. And as you can see here, from an internal standpoint, we've now hired a human resources manager. We've got about 100 people and about $10 million in sales. But that team of people, externally and internally, will fluctuate depending on the development stage of your company. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of these, again, in the interest of time. You can see that most of these talk about people. I talked about this concept of developing a strategic plan and using that, having a hiring system. That final bullet point, you know, I commented earlier when I started this last company, I felt like I needed to know all the answers, and nobody expects me to know, correct? What I learned pretty quickly was that I wanted to be the best CEO possible. So I ended up joining a group called Vistage. I paid $12,000 a year to be a member, and I spent a day a month to go to the Mint meetings. You think about that, I'm committing 5% of my time and a significant amount of money, capital, to go be a part of an organization where I sat there for 10 years. But I wanted to learn best practices for every aspect of how people become competent, quality CEOs. So I would encourage you to do the same. You don't have to spend the kind of money or time that I spent. Go down to the chamber. They have leadership roundtables where you can learn all about how to be a CEO. And again, all of this, if you look at in your book, you'll see some other lessons learned. Most of this is around people. And a couple of concluding thoughts for you. This is another Welsh comment that talks about being passionate and hiring passionate people to drive your business. It's important financially to know where you are, but it's more important to have people that are really really passionate about your business. Another thing that Mr. Welsh talked about was the 4 E's of leadership, talking about energy, and there's a definition for each of these: energizers, edge, and execute. Emphasis on the third edge. Can you make those really tough decisions? You're earning the big bucks to make the tough decisions. And we could spend a whole nother hour talking about the decisions that we've had to make throughout this whole time period that we ran the company. And then preparing yourself to win. There's a great series of books by an author called Zig Ziglar. And if you haven't heard of Zig Ziglar, I would encourage you to read some of his books. He talks about the whole concept of winning and attitude. And he has a great example of how he set his goals up and got it down to daily goals when he was trying to lose weight. And he took that same process into his business to help him develop a very successful business. And then the total cost of an incorrect hire, again, it depends on who that person is. We talked a little bit about that earlier on. And then other factors, if you've mishired a number of people and you have outside investors, guess what those outside investors are thinking? Bad decision maker, not good thoughts. Those aren't career-enhancing moves when you have a consistent pattern of hiring people that aren't producing. So a couple of quotes for you. Minds are like parachutes. They work best when they're open. I'd encourage you to think openly and broadly about everything that you're doing in your business. And one of the things that all of you do as entrepreneurs the great use of life is to spend it for something which outlasts it. And many of you will create companies that will outlast you, and I think that's the great benefit of entrepreneurship.